If the world feels too loud today, you're in the right place. Let the sound of rain and a gentle voice help you drift off. Subscribe if calm moments like this matter to you. What time do you usually start listening? He slept in the library. The first time I saw him, I thought he was simply resting his eyes. He sat in the far corner of the main reading room, where the morning light filtered through the high, dusted windows in long diagonal stripes across the wooden floor. His coat was old but clean, layered over a brown sweater with worn elbows. His head tilted slightly forward, chin resting gently on his chest, hands folded on top of a small canvas bag. From where I stood behind the returns desk, he looked like any tired visitor, someone who'd stayed up reading too late, or just needed a break from the noise outside. But when I returned from shelving books nearly an hour later, he hadn't moved. Still seated, still, as if folded into the hush of the room. I didn't wake him. The library had its unspoken rules, and one of them, the quietest, but most sacred, was this: if someone needs silence, we let them have it. Even when that silence is sleep, he returned the next day, and the next, always arriving just after the doors opened, always choosing the same chair by the far window, never speaking, never reading, just sitting, and slowly, inevitably, sleeping, not with deep, heavy breaths, but with that soft rhythm of someone who knows how to make themselves small. A presence so careful, it nearly vanished. It wasn't long before I began noticing the others noticing him. A few students glanced over their textbooks. One older man, a regular, nodded silently at me, then at the man in the corner, as if to say, "Do you see him too?" I nodded back. Yes, we saw him, but no one said a word. And in time, his presence folded into the space like a piece of furniture. Expected, quiet, real. I never asked his name. He never checked out a book. But once, while shelving in the aisle nearest his chair, I saw him holding a small paperback. The cover so faded I couldn't make out the title. He wasn't reading it, just holding it, like a stone in the pocket, like something that tethered him here gently. That afternoon, after he left, I found the book neatly placed on the return cart, even though he'd never borrowed it. Inside, a torn scrap of paper with one sentence: "Still here, just slower now." It wasn't signed, but I knew it was his. I don't know how I knew. I just did. And from that day, I began to wonder not just who he was, but what brought him here, to this quiet place where words surrounded him like a soft, unread song. He didn't disturb the silence. He became part of it. And somehow, we all let him stay. It began with the tea. One afternoon in early December, I brought a small metal thermos with me, filled with chamomile and honey, still warm, wrapped in a cloth napkin. I set it gently on the table beside his chair before returning to the front desk. I didn't leave a note, didn't gesture, just placed it there and continued with my day. When I checked back later, it was gone, and the napkin had been folded neatly, left exactly where I had set the thermos. That was all. No words, no acknowledgement, just that small return gesture of order, of care. The next day, I brought it again. He took it again and returned the napkin, always folded, always precise. After a week, I added a small paper sleeve around the thermos. On it, I had written, "You're welcome to rest here, as long as you need." The following morning, there was a change. When he entered, he paused slightly at the desk. Not long, just enough to meet my eyes. It was the first time he had looked at me directly. His expression was unreadable, not guarded, not open, but it held something steady, like he was trying to see whether I meant it. I nodded once, softly, and he moved on to his seat. That same day, after he left, I found something on the desk. A book, an old poetry collection, long out of print. Inside, another torn scrap of paper. This is the only place I still hear quiet. My hand stilled as I read it. I closed the book gently and set it aside, feeling the echo of that sentence hum quietly beneath my skin. The next week brought snow, heavy, thick flakes that muted the world outside. He arrived dusted in white, his coat darker with damp patches at the shoulders. I had brought an old scarf from home, deep green wool, one I no longer wore. I draped it over the back of his chair before he arrived. When he sat, he didn't touch it. Not at first, but sometime later, I looked up and saw it tucked gently around his shoulders, as if it had always belonged there. We still never spoke, but something had shifted. There was a rhythm now, a quiet thread that passed between us. Sometimes he left a folded page in a book I'd find it closing. Sometimes I left a clementine on the corner of his table. It wasn't charity, it wasn't friendship in any formal way. It was something softer, something like shared presence. And slowly, I began to feel less like the person who observed him, and more like someone who had been invited to sit silently beside whatever it was he carried. Not to fix it, not even to know it, just to be there. And in a world where people rush to label everything, that I realized was more than enough. On a Monday morning, he didn't come. It was raining, soft and steady, the kind that seems to blur edges of buildings, of memories, of thoughts, and can't quite finish. I kept glancing at the door, not anxiously, but with the quiet rhythm of someone noticing an absence. The thermos sat untouched on the table beside his usual seat. The scarf remained folded as it had been the day before. By noon, I moved the thermos to the staff shelf, still warm. By closing time, it had gone cold. Tuesday passed the same way. Gray skies, fewer visitors. The usual silence, but with a thread pulled loose. I tried not to let it mean anything. People change course. People leave. But his stillness had been part of the room for so long, its absence rang louder than noise. On Wednesday, just after 10, he returned. I saw him before he entered. He stood just outside the glass door, coat damp, eyes lowered, holding something close to his chest. A book. I didn't move, just watched as he stepped inside, nodded once in my direction slower than usual, and walked back to his chair. He didn't sleep. For the first time in weeks, he didn't lean back, didn't let the hush pull him downward. Instead, he opened the book and began to read. It was a hardcover. The spine cracked gently as he opened it, and I recognized the faded lettering on the dust jacket. A novel we had shelved in the forgotten literature section. It hadn't been checked out in years. As he read, the light from the tall windows fell across the pages. He turned them slowly, carefully, as if listening to each word before letting it go. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer tea. That day, silence had a different shape. At some point in the afternoon, while returning a cart to the poetry section, I passed behind him. He was on page 87. The same scarf was draped across his lap like a folded letter. As I turned to leave, I noticed something tucked beneath the thermos I had left anyway, a single card from the card catalog. On the back, written in the same faint hand I had come to recognize, were the words, "I didn't think I'd be missed." I folded the card slowly, pressed my thumb to the paper for a moment, then returned to the desk without a word. That evening, as I turned off the lights and drew the metal gate across the front entrance, I let the card stay in my pocket, not to file away, not to keep as a memento, just to carry. A reminder that even in places where no words are spoken, we still notice each other. And sometimes, just knowing you were seen, that's what brings you back. It was near closing time when it happened. The light outside had already begun to fade, settling into that deep, warm tone just before dusk folds the day shut. Most of the visitors had gone, and the library had slipped into that particular hush it wore so naturally, where the rustling of a turned page sounded like a wave. He was still in his usual chair, the novel now nearly finished, the same green scarf folded neatly over the edge of the table. I was shelving the last cart near the window when he stood. I didn't look directly at him, not out of avoidance, but respect. We had built this quiet together. I wasn't about to break it. He walked slowly toward the desk, the book held loosely in his hand. His steps were steady but soft, like someone approaching the end of something. When he reached the counter, he paused. I looked up. He didn't place the book down. He didn't slide it across. He simply held it, both hands wrapped around the cover like it still contained something living. And then, just above a whisper, he said it. "Thank you." That was all. 2 words, spoken like a note at the end of a long song. His voice was low, textured by time, the kind of voice that carried more in its pauses than its sounds. I didn't respond right away. I just nodded. Slowly, gently, and something in my chest, something quiet and settled, moved. "Any time?" I said softly. My voice felt louder than I meant, though it barely rose above the whisper. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. One corner of his mouth. That was all. Then, carefully, he placed the book on the desk and turned to go. He didn't take the scarf. I started to call after him, not with words, but a sound, a step. But I stopped myself. The scarf wasn't forgotten. It was left. And I understood that. Sometimes the most meaningful gestures aren't the ones we carry away, but the ones we choose to leave behind. After he left, I stood there a moment longer, hand resting gently on the spine of the novel. The thermos was still warm beside it. That night, I turned off the library lights slower than usual. Each switch felt like closing a chapter. Not the final one, just the end of a part. A soft page turning in a room that had, for a little while, held something unspoken and sacred. And when I passed his chair on my way out, the scarf still folded there, I placed my hand on it gently, not to move it, not to claim it, just to say I know. The scarf stayed there for days, folded neatly over the edge of the chair, untouched, a quiet artifact. After a week, I moved it to the shelf behind the desk, not to put it away, but to keep it safe. He didn't return, not that week, not the next. The chair remained empty, though I still found myself glancing toward it during the late afternoons, expecting nothing but noticing everything. The library held his absence like a closed book still full of words, but unread. I didn't talk about it. No one asked. But even the other regulars seemed to move more gently through the space, as if respecting something they couldn't quite name. It was early spring when I found it. I was reshelving a slim volume of poetry, one of the older ones from the back wall, its spine soft and gold flecked with age. As I opened it to scan the inside label, a folded page fell out. I caught it before it hit the ground. It wasn't scrap paper this time. It was full size, carefully folded in thirds. The handwriting inside was the same slanted, steady, sparse, but the tone had shifted. There was more space between the words, like they had been chosen carefully, but not rushed. The note read, "Do you believe we can ever really return to the places we've found peace? Or do we only pass through them once, carrying their quiet with us?" That was all. No signature. But it didn't need one. I stood there, holding the letter for a long time. The poem it had been tucked into was about a train that never stopped, only slowed enough to let people jump. I hadn't read that poem in years, but now it seemed written for this very moment. I refolded the note and returned it to the book, not out of habit, but because I knew that's where it wanted to stay. Like all the messages he'd left before, nothing demanded, nothing taken, only placed gently where someone might find it. That evening, I sat at the front desk, long after closing, the lights off, the windows reflecting the soft blue of dusk. I thought about his question, not whether it had an answer, but whether he meant for it to, and I found myself whispering into the quiet. Maybe peace isn't a place we go back to. Maybe it's something we offer forward. The scarf still waited on the shelf behind me. I didn't touch it, but I thought perhaps it would warm someone else someday. Perhaps that's how peace travels, not through return, but through passing on what held us, even for a little while. It was a quiet Thursday when she walked in early, just after we opened. She couldn't have been more than 20. Bundled in a light coat too thin for the lingering spring wind, eyes scanning the room, not for books, but for somewhere to simply be. I watched her from the desk as she moved, not in a rush, not lost more, like someone following an invisible path. She paused briefly at the poetry shelf, her fingers brushing gently along the spines, then turned toward the far end of the room, the corner, his corner. She sat down in the same chair he had once made invisible. The sun was already slanting through the windows, lighting up the wood grain along the floor. She placed a small notebook on the table, untouched, and then slowly reached into the pocket of her coat. From it, she unfolded something familiar. Not a letter, not a photo, but a small piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, creased from being opened and closed too many times. I couldn't see what was written on it, but I didn't need to. The way she held it, two fingers at the corners, carefully, reverently told me all I needed to know. It was his. Or, at least, it had once passed through his hands. She sat there a long time, Not reading, not writing, just present. Breathing in the room, letting the silence settle into her sleeves. Eventually, I rose from the desk and walked toward the back shelves with a cart I didn't need to push. As I passed behind her, I slowed slightly, enough to glimpse the note before I turned away. The handwriting was the same. I caught only the last few words. "You are allowed to rest." I felt something press softly in my chest, a weight that didn't hurt more like recognition. When I returned to the desk, I opened the drawer where I'd tucked away the green scarf weeks ago. I hesitated for a moment, then folded it again tighter, smoother, and carried it across the room. As I approached her table, she looked up. Her eyes were soft, rimmed with the kind of quiet that comes after too many unanswered questions. I didn't say anything. I simply placed the scarf gently on the corner of her table and nodded. Her hands paused for a moment. Then, slowly, she drew the scarf toward her and draped it across her lap. We didn't speak, but as I walked away, I knew something had shifted again. Not ended, just moved forward. Like a breath passed from one mouth to another, and for the first time in weeks, I stopped watching the door for him. Not because he wouldn't return, but because, in a way, he already had. She began coming in more regularly after that. Not every day, but enough for a rhythm to form. She'd arrive mid-morning, always alone, always carrying that same small notebook and a pencil worn down almost to its base. She sat in his chair, though now it felt like hers too, the light still falling through the window, touching her shoulder the way it used to fall across the fold of his scarf. Sometimes she read. Sometimes she wrote. But more often, she just sat, present, aware, listening perhaps, to the same silence that had once held him steady. I never asked her name. She never offered. That wasn't the kind of conversation we had, or needed. But we exchanged soft glances, small nods, a shared understanding between two people who had, for different reasons, stayed behind in a world that moved too fast. Then, one afternoon, I found something new. I was shelving books in the poetry section, that quiet stretch of forgotten titles that barely moved from year to year, when I noticed a small notebook tucked neatly between two volumes. It didn't belong there. The spine was smooth, unmarked, and the edges of the pages were hand-worn, soft from touch. I opened it slowly. Inside, the first few pages were blank. Then the writing began faint pencil, careful and deliberate. Not rushed, not overly poetic, just true. I recognized her handwriting. And as I read, I realized something else. It wasn't about her. Not really. It was about him. Page after page, she described the way he used to sit, the way he folded into the room, the way he never tried to disappear but somehow always did. She wrote about the way people glanced at him without staring, the way he touched the books, even when he didn't read them, the way he left behind messages without needing answers. She had been watching, even then, even when we didn't know her. In one entry, she wrote, he didn't need to speak to say something. He was the kind of man who taught people how to listen. I closed the notebook gently, holding it for a moment in my hands. Then I returned it to the same spot on the shelf, not because I didn't want to keep it, but because I understood it was meant to be found, not owned, meant to be discovered by someone else, someday, who might also be looking for a place where stillness meant safety. That evening, as I turned off the library lights, I paused longer in the poetry section. Let my hand rest lightly on the spine of the notebook, still tucked between poems, and in that quiet, I whispered something I hadn't realized I needed to say. You mattered, not just to me, not just once, but again and again in echoes. Spring melted into early summer without making a sound. The light in the library shifted, not brighter, just wider, warmer somehow. People came and went. Some I knew by name, most I didn't. But something in the room had changed. Not visibly. You wouldn't notice it if you rushed in looking for a book and rushed out. But if you stayed, really stayed, you'd feel it. A softness in the air. A stillness that welcomed, not watched. It began with one note. A stranger, maybe a student, had slipped a folded piece of paper between the pages of a worn-out essay collection. It said, "If you're tired, this chair understands." A few days later, someone else left a sketch, a pencil drawing of a window, with a beam of light cutting across an empty table. Then, a pressed flower. Then a page torn from a novel, underlined. You are not lost. You are only quiet for a while. And so it grew, like something alive. The back shelves became a kind of soft archive, not of information, but of presence. Things people left not to be found, but to remain. The girl who had taken his seat still came, sometimes, less often now, but every visit felt purposeful. Once, I watched her pull the notebook she'd left from between the poetry books. She didn't open it, just held it in her hands for a long time, then returned it, gently, exactly where it had been. I never asked her about him. She never asked me. But I think we both knew we'd been given something, not just a memory, but a rhythm. A way of moving through the world that didn't demand sound to be heard. One afternoon, I added something of my own, a simple card tucked behind a reference atlas. It read, "This place remembers you." I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The library itself had become the signature. It carried all of us, the ones who stayed, the ones who left quietly, the ones who slept beneath windows until they felt seen. One day, I know, someone else will sit in that corner and wonder why it feels softer than the rest. They won't know his name, or mine, or hers, but they'll feel the hush differently. They'll know they can rest, and when they do, perhaps they'll leave something behind too. A word, a drawing, a sentence folded like a blanket. I will keep watching, not out of duty, out of care, because this library has become more than shelves and books. It's become a place where silence is not absence, it's invitation. And somewhere in that quiet, someone is listening.